Governor Braun's budget proposal. Braun begins remaking the administrative side of state government, plus the House GOP agenda, and more. From the television studios at WFYI, it's Indiana Week in Review for the week ending January 17th, 2025.
Indiana Week in Review is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Additional support is provided by the Indy Chamber, working to unite business and community to maintain a strong economy and quality of life.
This week, Governor Mike Braun unveiled a state budget proposal that provides nearly $700 million in tax relief, inflationary funding increases for K-12 schools, and enough money to eliminate child care wait lists. It's built in part on Braun's promise to cut hundreds of millions in government spending.
The tax relief in Braun's proposal includes increasing income tax deductions to match inflation, eliminating the tax on tips and retirement income, and creating sales tax holidays for school and youth sports supplies and outdoor recreation equipment. To help make that funding work in a tight budget, Braun is pledging to cut $700 million in government spending over the next 2 years.
And that's not because you're trying to be stingy, it's because that's called productivity.
The Braun administration provided almost no specifics about what cuts will be made, though the budget proposal does include a $50 million per year cut to the local public health funding program. Democrats say there are things to applaud in Braun's budget, but question how he'll cut government spending without slashing jobs and services.
Is Braun's plan to cut government spending by $700 million achievable? It's the first question for our Indiana Week in Review panel. Democrat Ann Delaney. Republican Chris Mitchum, John Schwannis, host of Indiana Lawmakers, and Nikki Kelly, editor-in-chief of the Indiana Capitol Chronicle. I'm Indiana Public Broadcasting State House Bureau Chief Brandon Smith. Ann Delaney, can Mike Braun cut that much spending without slashing jobs and services?
Well, my understanding is $500 million of that's coming out of the IEDC budget. Okay, so, you know, the legislature's been looking for a way to rein them in. That would do it. That would do it.
Definitely do it.
I think the proposal to cut the public health funding is absurd on its face, and I hope it's going to die quickly. I mean, we've actually got all 92 counties invested in this now, and we're going to hopefully make our population healthier and cut down on the need for more expensive health care services. The other thing that gets me about this is, you know, he's cutting the spending and then he's doing tax cuts. Okay. The tax cuts, all right, fine on tips and on school supplies and stuff. I don't care about that. But not taxing retirement income. You know, almost a quarter of all Hoosiers are on Social Security alone, and they're the most needy, and this does absolutely nothing for them, okay? The average pension income in Indiana is $21,000. This saves $600 a year. Not bad, not bad. But if you're making $200,000 a year from your 401k retirement plan, it's going to save you $6,000. I mean, it's the same kind of thing Republicans always do. They give a little bit to some of the needy, but certainly not all of the needy, and the bulk of the resources go to the people who can afford to pay them in the first place. We should be taking that money and using it for young families, down payments on houses, child care, preschool, things that would grow the economy by allowing people to work. We don't do any of that. We don't have the vision to plan ahead, to talk about how we're going to make this state more prosperous for everybody.
And not a lot of specifics on what he's going to cut yet, but he talks a lot about efficiencies, squeeze every Can you squeeze $700 million of efficiency out of the Indiana state government?
Yeah, I mean, I think the $700 million number is there for a reason. I think the budget director and the new agency chair that presented the budget pointed out that all the state agencies submitted their budgets back in May. So as soon as the transition team got in, they got the budgets in November. So I think between November and now, they were able to formulate that $700 million number. I don't think that's a pie in the sky number. So I think they do have some plans to potentially implement some of those some of those savings, whether it be through the state contracting power. You know, there's talks about trying to upgrade technology across agencies that I think can have some long-term savings potentially. And I mean, when it comes to how the budget looks now, I think they did a pretty good job considering the kind of the landscape they face. There's so many different moving parts. You have a road funding bill in the House. You have Medicaid caps in the Senate. There's a bill to potentially kind of revolutionize how unemployment works in the Senate as well. So there's a lot of moving pieces, and we've talked about how you started at education and then you looked at Medicaid, which is fully funded, by the way, when it comes to helping those in need, when it comes to health care. There was no cuts there, despite the Senate potentially capping that on that side. So with all of the moving pieces around, I think they did a really good job of using the money that is available whenever it's expected to, flatline over the next couple of years.
Making sure there isn't any more money available because you're going to give a lot of it back.
I want to ask about education funding in Braun's budget. So I called them inflationary, but we were just talking about it. That's normal inflation at 2% increases. We haven't been in normal inflation for quite some time, and Braun's budget director said he thought that Braun was being more than generous to schools. When, if you couple this with property tax reform that Braun wants, let's just say that happened, schools would lose money in the next budget cycle. And then Braun says if schools need more money than he's prepared to give them, they've mismanaged their budgets. Do you think public schools out there have been mismanaging their budgets when they're asking for more than a 2% increase?
Boy, there's so many parts of that. I talk about moving pieces and parts.
Sure.
I think the vast majority of Hoosier schools probably are good stewards of their finances and resources. They recognize that if they're going to go to voters and ask for money through a referendum, that they need to show that they have been good stewards. Otherwise, I don't think a lot of voters are going to be saying yes to districts that have sort of, let's throw a little bit here, let's throw a little bit there. It used to be easier come budget time because lawmakers could say, I support K through 12 education and tuition support, I'm there. Now that question comes with an asterisk, or certainly the answer does, because you have divisions that are competing to a certain extent in a very real sense for dollars. It's the traditional public schools. It's the charter schools, which seem to have really flexed their muscles and are poised to do more so in this coming session for a number of reasons, and then the parochial schools that have through vouchers. So this is one of those things where you can attach, when all is said and done, any label, and I'm sure you can find a way to justify it. We've seen we always joke, and we have often in recent years about the word historic increases for K through 12 education, and we've become so accustomed to that. If in fact it ends up being flatlined, I think that meets the definition of historic, because it's not in the way we want. Not in a way you want, but I guess technically speaking.
Obviously, any governor's budget proposal is going to get changed a lot by the two houses of the General Assembly by the end of the process. What in here do you think lawmakers are really going to like and try to keep?
I think a 2% increase for schools is not. I think a lot of them would be happy with that, especially in the second year in which the entire revenue forecast shows the state getting hardly any new money. So I'm not even sure.
And the amount that it needs for Medicaid right now more than eclipses what it would get.
I'm not even sure how under Braun's budget that's a balanced budget in the second year, balanced overall, but because there's not any new money going to be coming in the second year while Medicaid's growing, and now at least 2% the second year for schools. So I think that's actually something that lawmakers could get around. I'll be interested to hear how they react to the third of a cut to the public health funding. That's very intriguing. And also, it did fully fund the Medicaid, and the Senate is obviously hoping to curb Medicaid costs. So maybe that's one at the end where they just assume the full cost of Medicaid the whole way, and then at the very end, if they're close on a bill that could make them some savings, that helps reach the $700 million.
I will say Representative Greg Porter had a good point of saying the day that the April revenue forecast is supposed to come out, I think they're going to have maybe a week to take all those new numbers and apply it to the new budget. So, I think more than ever, the governor's budget is going to be a good basis moving forward.
And the other thing you could do too is you don't have to take away income tax on retirement income, especially when things are as tight as they are. That's going to cost us $700 million by the fourth year of his administration.
And that's conveniently how much money we're going to save in efficiencies.
The reasons we've discussed here, there's not a lot of appetite for new expenditures. It's just the opposite. But one thing I think to your question, what will enjoy support, is in a way, it was already on the books, but it will be funded potentially, and that is the housing fund. That, I mean, we do have certainly a housing crisis, and it goes from being a concept theoretically to being something that communities, and this is about providing communities with funding to do infrastructure, water, sewer, those types of things, so the developers can then come in and build neighborhoods in a more affordable fashion.
And the Education Scholarship Fund for Special Needs is also getting a very large increase.
I could see that also being part of the final budget package. All right. Speaking of Governor Mike Braun, he also signed a series of executive orders this week that begin to remake the administrative side of state government.
Braun says he wants to streamline government to ensure it works better for Hoosiers.
We want to make sure we're maximizing the impact of taxpayer dollars, that state agencies are making smart, efficient decisions.
The executive orders include plans to eliminate 25% of state regulations over the next 4 years, eliminate degree requirements for state jobs wherever possible, reduce or eliminate background checks for professional licenses unless related to the job responsibilities, and prioritize work-based experience like apprenticeships over degree and training requirements for professional licenses. Braun acknowledges there is risk to his approach.
I can tell you, if you're naturally risk-averse, you're going to be in a broad band of mediocrity.
Braun's orders also include a public dashboard with performance metrics for his cabinet and senior staff.
Chris Mitchum, does Braun's approach risk compromising safety and quality in both state employees and licensed professionals?
If you ask Governor Braun, it might. I mean, he just said it right there that he knows there's some risk associated with this, but I think it lands in that executive order in particular lands in a good area because we all know of, the entry-level positions out there that might require 3 years of experience. That's hard to fill. We all know people that are really good at their jobs because they've lived in it, they've worked in it for a long time, but they may not have a bachelor's degree. And if you're on an application website that says if you have a bachelor's degree, you're out.
Or if you don't,
then you're out. Then you're out. So, listen, I think the Braun administration knows that, the head of the, public health department should probably be a medical professional, right? Like, I don't think they're. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So. The executive order is good because it doesn't just do mass cuts across the board of slashing requirements. It's an agency by agency position. Look at what your agency does best and cancel it out that way. And that way, I think you can get a lot more qualified people that are actually living it with the work experience without that initial cutoff of just having a certain education requirement.
Yeah, with a few exceptions. A lot of these executive orders weren't black and white mandates. You must do this, this, and this. It's we should explore the things we just heard in that video package. Are these good goals to sort of relook at state employee qualifications as state licensing, professional licenses?
I think it's always good to look at those, but the danger on this is you're taking objective criteria for a position and replacing it with subjective criteria. Is my experience exactly what the kind of experience you need for that job? That's going to be debated, I don't know how many different ways. If it can be done, fine. I'd like to talk about the other executive orders.
I had a feeling you might.
Putting the flag up to full, all the MAGA things he wanted to do, the flags and taking away diversity and the Office of Diversity and then what was the other? Oh, they can't work at home anymore. Does that apply to the Secretary of State's office too? Does the brother-in-law have to come in then if he's not? I don't know.
I'm not sure that does qualify. I want to ask the
separately elected office, so no, it doesn't.
I don't think it does. The executive order that did get a lot of attention was closing the Chief Equity, Inclusion, and Opportunity Office and banning DEI in state government. Do you think that will have a meaningful impact on the way state government runs?
Probably not to the average person. It gets a lot of sexy headlines, but the fact is it's going to affect some training that I think new employees were offered. The office itself was paid for by an outside grant, so it doesn't even save state dollars. I think it's more symbolic than not. The actual work from home executive order I found to be the more interesting one. And having especially watched Governor Holcomb go through it, they had a bunch of people working from home during COVID. Then post-COVID, he tried to get them all back. And there was a revolt. And then there was such huge turnover. They then had to come up with these remote and hybrid options because everyone back then, you got to remember 2 years ago, people were like, no, I can find a different job where I can, have my. And so now I think Governor Braun has seen a little bit more of a pendulum back to the work from your office space. And so I think that's a more fascinating look for a state that has occasionally had turnover issues with state employees.
I agree on the idea of, I think, closing the Equity, Inclusion, and Opportunity Office and banning DEI is more symbolic. The flag, I don't.
The flag is tacky, is what it is.
I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about the flag. I want to talk, yes, it's symbolic, but I want to talk about something the Black Caucus raised with that issue, which is he's saying you're replacing DEI in state government with MEI, which is merit, excellence, and innovation.
Yeah.
As if being diverse and being excellent aren't the same thing. Is that a problem?
I mean, it certainly begs that question, and you're raising it right now. And certainly you would like to think that they're synonymous, that diversity and a meritocracy are one and the same. Ideally, it's about opportunity and the ability to advance. I don't think on this issue, on that executive order, you're right. Hoosiers, the average Hoosier, no impact. Average Hoosier. To the extent it has any impact, it'll be economic development, because remember, it's all about the image of a state. Some employers might say that's a plus. Other employers might say more evidence that Indiana is whatever stereotype we thought Indiana was, and it's not the kind of welcoming environment that we want for our workforce. So that could be problematic. Just one other observation about the first topic with the notion of lowering licensing requirements and so forth. It may work. The risk, though, and the governor talked about risk, if you've lowered the standards or the requirements and you got a bad apple and something happens, then inevitably the stories are this person occupied a position that in the past he or she would not have been eligible for. You never get dinged for upping the licensure requirements. If you have a bad apple, you say, this is precisely why we put those standards in place. So this is a risk that goes as long as he's governor, because that doesn't go away. It just takes one bad apple who wouldn't have qualified before to screw things up.
All right, time now for viewer feedback. Each week we pose an unscientific online poll question, and this week's question is, do you support Governor Braun's decision to close Indiana's Equity, Inclusion, and Opportunity Office? A, yes, or B, no. Last week we asked you whether to curb Medicaid spending, lawmakers should limit the number of people allowed on the Healthy Indiana plan. 15% of you say yes, 85% say no. If you'd like to take part in the poll, go to WFYI.org/IWIR and look for the poll. The Indiana House GOP's 2025 legislative priorities, unveiled this week, hope to build on previous initiatives that aim to bring down health care and housing costs.
Representative Martin Carbaugh's legislation would examine what nonprofit hospitals are charging for services compared to the Medicare reimbursement rate.
If you're charging over a certain level, and we have a starting point in the bill, are you really a not-for-profit hospital anymore, or are you a for-profit hospital?
The measure would revoke nonprofit status for hospitals charging more than 200% of the Medicare reimbursement rate. On housing, Representative Doug Miller's bill would put more money into a previously created housing infrastructure loan fund for local governments.
And it also encourages our communities to work with housing providers to meet needs across the state.
The legislation would prioritize loans for communities focused on policies like multifamily and higher density housing.
Counties that nobody wants. Nikki Kelly, on revoking the nonprofit status of these hospitals, we've seen State House Republicans propose really bold health care bills before, only to weaken or even abandon them later in session. Does that start to change this year?
I think we're at the sort of, we either have to do something strident and strict or give up at this point, because we've tried all the sort of steps up to it. We've tried approvals of mergers and monitoring and transparency of your prices, and nothing's really working. And so I'm not going to use a phrase my dad would say from growing up, but it's either move forward with some real strict and new rules or just give up.
I think I know exactly what that phrase is, and my grandfather used to use the same one. We actually talked about the housing infrastructure loan program. I think that is something that a lot of people on both sides of the aisle support. It's making sure it's targeted to building homes that are affordable for people on the lower end of the income scale. But on the hospital stuff and the healthcare stuff, they're trying to build more on the transparency, but at some point, Do you have to crack the whip a little
Apparently
bit?
something's got to happen as long as Hoosiers, I'll look at my midsection, are not the healthiest lot, generally, statistically speaking. That's going to add on to costs. The problem, I think, with this ongoing debate, and the reason we don't have resolution is if this were Western, we wouldn't know who's the villain, who's wearing the black hat and who's wearing the white hat. Because it's a lot of this, and everybody has a good point. You can't just fault hospitals. Hospitals, a lot of the smaller ones, have really taken it on the chin, which is why, more than half of Indiana counties don't even have a hospital anymore. So you can't paint with a broad brush. A lot of this is a shot across the bow, and it sometimes works. We saw one of the large nonprofit hospitals that ponied up $500 million voluntarily to education of medical students in our state. And I think that was largely not only altruism.
That was to clear some of the reserves on their books.
Well, and it wasn't just altruism.
Yeah, that wasn't altruism. That was we didn't want to look like we had quite so much.
It was a response to okay, we're going to placate you a little bit. So but that only goes so far, to your point. But again, we don't know who's to blame. Hoosiers for being unhealthy, hospitals, a few for overcharging, insurance companies, benefit managers. Maybe everybody's to blame. I don't know.
I think the answer is probably everybody's to blame, but we're starting to see action on all of those sides. We saw the prior authorization reform that ended up dying a quick death last session get brought back up this session, so we'll see if it goes further this year. But yeah, to be continued. A cannabis legalization coalition says moving Indiana directly to full adult legal use is the best way to ensure a regulated market that also addresses public safety concerns.
Some state lawmakers, including Republican Heath Van Natter, are part of the new coalition.
To be clear, this is not about promoting cannabis use. It's about addressing the reality of its presence in our society with a responsible, conservative solution that upholds our principles of limited government, law and order, and the protection of families.
Van Natter is authoring a bill this session that would fully legalize cannabis for adult use and establish a regulatory framework for its sale in Indiana. Republican leaders in both the House and Senate remain unconvinced about the benefits of cannabis legalization. New Governor Mike Braun has said he's open to discussing medical cannabis.
John Schwanitz, we've talked for so long about cannabis legislation in Indiana making progress. Is progress alone worth celebration anymore? Or is it time to do it or not?
Also, depending on what side you're on. There was a lot of momentum. You had groups that traditionally weren't supportive, like the veterans groups, the American Legion and others, saying our members are not crazed hippies. They want this for pain control and pain management. And we saw a number of Republicans come forward. We saw the Democratic state chair a few years ago say our three-part priority is marijuana legalization, marijuana legalization, marijuana legalization. I kind of think, though, that was the and it'll probably happen. Don't get me wrong. It's going to happen eventually, but not this session, because I think it was the high water mark sort of in terms of that enthusiasm, maybe last biennium, last session. And now I'm actually seeing legislation I hadn't seen as frequently before, which is putting restrictions
on advertising.
One would be a complete ban on advertising in all platforms. Others would be a more traditional, away from schools, away from churches, et cetera.
Are the objections of people like Rod Bray and particularly Todd Houston, who's really opposed to this, is that going to be the thing that stops it for the foreseeable future?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have a body, and the Senate Republicans in particular, that have historically been against a simple cigarette tax increase when we've been, the lowest in our region for years now. So I think, and there's also a point, there's a reason why they want to go from, 0 to 100 when it comes to full scale legalization, skip the medical part, because just procedurally, if you go from this to medical, you're going to have that 3 or 4 years where we let medical play out, let's get the research before we even consider going to full, which is going to be another 2 or 3 years of advocacy strategy.
Yeah. All right. Finally, it's Indiana versus Ohio in the inaugural college football playoff national championship game on Monday as the Notre Dame Fighting Irish face off against the Buckeyes of Ohio State. Chris Mitchum, as an Ohio State Buckeye fan, we know who you're rooting for, but do you think the Irish have a chance?
Listen, you just outed one of my deepest, darkest secrets as somebody who loves Indiana, and if the pin didn't
so much less of you now.
If the pin didn't give it away. Listen, Notre Dame Irish fans love Marcus Freeman. My girlfriend loves Marcus Freeman, and he has them playing very, very well. Definitely more than me, I'll tell you what. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't think Ohio State was the more talented team. If we play our game, we should get the win, I think.
As a lifelong Notre Dame Fighting Irish fan, I think I agree with you. I do think Ohio State is going to win. I'm hoping for a good competitive game, but can the Irish?
Maybe they'll surprise you.
Can the Irish pull it out?
I hope so. Ordinarily, I root for the Big Ten if there's a Big Ten in it, but not Ohio State. Oh, how I hate Ohio State. I'm for Notre Dame, no question.
We saw Ohio Governor Mike DeWine and new Governor Mike Braun make a little wager on social media this morning too, Nikki.
And as both a Hoosier and a Buckeye, because I grew up in Ohio, but I went to the real Ohio University, so I cannot in any manner root for Ohio State.
Yeah.
So
This was an easy one for
Fighting
you.
Irish.
I'm not sure. I would quibble with the framing of your question because I think the big winner here is Indiana University football because they lost 2 games this season.
Right.
If you look at regular season and the playoffs, who were those 2 teams they lost to? Let's think about that. Oh yeah, these 2 teams.
And our loss to Notre Dame was the closest of all of those playoff games.
And I will also say this, before the show, a couple people told me that we should mention that Indiana only lost those 2 teams, and I said, don't worry, John will do it for us. That's Indiana Week in Review for this week. Our panel is Democrat Ann Delaney, Republican Chris Mitchum, John Schwannis of Indiana Lawmakers, and Nikki Kelly of the Indiana Capitol Chronicle. You can find Indiana Week in Review's podcast and episodes at WFYI.org/IWIR or on the PBS app. I'm Brandon Smith of Indiana Public Broadcasting. Join us next time, because a lot can happen in an Indiana week. The views expressed are solely those of the panelists.
Indiana Week in Review is produced by WFYI in association with Indiana Public Broadcasting Stations. Additional support is provided by the Indy Chamber, working to unite business and community to maintain a strong economy and quality of life.